Hi everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is Rachel MacArthur and I'm a Professional Development Counselor for the PHI Ontario branch. We will remain in lecture mode for the duration of the webinar, so if you have any questions, please type them through the chat pod located in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I have the privilege of introducing our presenter today, Leela Steiner. I was actually able to see her present at the Sci-Fi National Conference last year, and I'm excited that we get to share this presentation with all of you. Leela will be presenting today about growing at home, the health and safety concerns for personal cannabis cultivation. Leela Steiner is an environmental health and knowledge translation scientist at the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. She has a background in chemical management, science policy, and regulatory frameworks for emerging contaminants. At the NCCEH, Leela is the lead on the Cannabis and Environmental Health file, focusing on risk communication and personal cultivation. She is also currently a Bridge Fellow at the University of British Columbia. Her recent research has included work on endocrine disrupting compounds, food contact materials, and the science policy interface. Okay, Leela, you're all set.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Rachel, and thank you to everybody for signing in today. I'm going to start right off the bat by saying that I have an unfortunate bout of bronchitis at the moment, so if the line ever goes dead for a second, it's because I've muted it to cough in the background. So I'm going to apologize up front about that particular situation. Rachel, next slide. So before I get into cannabis cultivation risks, I'm just going to give you a little background about our organization and the group that we're a part of. So if you're not aware, the National Collaborating Centers for Public Health were established by the Public Health Agency of Canada in 2005 with the goal of promoting the use of knowledge and evidence by different public health practitioners and policymakers around Canada. So we are one of 6 NCCs, the Environmental Health NCC, and the other 5 are Aboriginal health, methods and tools, infectious diseases, healthy public policy, and determinants of health. So we are one of that family that try to focus on getting evidence-based information to public health practitioners like yourself. Next. Now, our mandate in particular is threefold. Firstly, we do try to synthesize and exchange knowledge, which means we're incorporating evidence from research and experience, specifically with the goal of influencing practice. We also make an effort to identify gaps in knowledge when we're doing that kind of evidence review so that we can encourage new research to be done in particular areas that are lacking. And thirdly, we want to build capacity, which means we want to provide tools and establish networks and connect different professionals who are working on the same projects but might not know it across the country. Our target audience for all of this work is people like yourself, public health inspectors, as well as medical health officers, environmental health officers, and other environmental health practitioners. And before I get into the cannabis stuff, I do need to say in this presentation, as with all of my presentations, that neither the NCCEH nor myself have a financial interest in the cannabis industry in any way. So just going forward, we're trying to present as much of an unbiased perspective as we can on some of these issues. Next. Next, Rachel. Thanks. Okay, so how did this project really get started for us? It was born strangely, oh sorry, no, don't go next again. Go back to framing questions. After some media coverage of cannabis-related explosions, which I'm sure you've read about in the press over the last couple of years, several fire departments actually contacted us directly about information related to the types of hazards that might be encountered in fighting fires. And so this led us to begin to identify and synthesize knowledge that were related to all different forms of environmental health risks from home cultivation. And so we put together these framing questions to kind of guide the project. The first one is, what environmental health hazards are associated with cannabis cultivation, processing, or use? How will legalization affect the extent, scale, and conditions under which cannabis is cultivated, either in commercial or personal settings? And what measures can be implemented to reduce exposures in all phases of this process? Next. So today I want to talk about 5 key areas of risk that are spread throughout the production process. And those are access and accidental poisoning, indoor air quality, inappropriate use of pesticides, electrical and fire hazards, which also include explosion hazards, and also radiation hazards. As we go along, I'm also going to talk about some policy considerations relevant to each environmental health risk so that we can think about how we might design proactive interventions for each of these issues. Once I've gone over these risks, I'm going to switch gears a bit to close with a brief discussion of risk communication in the context of cannabis, and then we'll be able to have some time for discussion at the end. So next. Something we're not going to talk about today is actually the health effects of cannabis consumption. So if you do need to present info on those health effects, this is a document that was put together by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which uses a fantastic strength of evidence approach, which is to say that it rates health evidence as either insufficient, limited, moderate, substantial, or conclusive. And it's a massive evidence review. It really does allow you and us and anybody who's interested in the health effects to present information in context and kind of get away from some of the hysteria that tends to come with cannabis. So I do highly encourage you to look at this document if it is something you're interested in. And we have listed it and put the link in PDF up on our NCCEH cannabis topic page where there are a whole bunch of different resources on different issues related to cannabis. Next. Okay, so before we get into each of those 5 risks I mentioned, I want to give a little bit of context on some factors that actually impact the severity and likelihood of the occurrence of the risks I just mentioned. Some of these factors are truly difficult to extrapolate from the commercial context to the personal home-growing context, but they do offer some lessons, so I think it's worth going over. As I've noted on the slide, most commercial operations are medium to large in scale in Canada, and there are currently 67 active licenses for medical growers. Unlike in home growing situations, on the other hand, these are subject to inspection and oftentimes sporadic testing. When we talk about personal cultivation in Canada, Bill C-45 has enacted a limit of 4 budding plants per household. But this is, as I'm sure you can imagine, very difficult to regulate and enforce, so the likelihood of overproduction is quite high, which I think gives a little bit of context to some of the risks I'm going to talk about. There's also very limited guidance on how to grow, process, or dispose of these plants safely, which is another real issue going forward. And at the same time, there's no reason to believe, based on evidence from various states that have legalized, that illegal grow-ops are going away or will go away over time as legalization steps in here. Next. So let's turn to our first risk, which is access and accidental poisoning. It's not at all surprising that having cannabis plants, products, and waste in the home increases the risk that children, pets, or unaware adults are going to inadvertently consume cannabis with possible detrimental effects. This combined with the lack of an in-home possession limit, with the exception of a few provinces and jurisdictions like BC that recently implemented a 1,000-gram in-home possession limit, but most places haven't. It does mean that households can accumulate significant quantities of cannabis, which is partly why some public health and safety organizations have recommended a total precautionary ban on personal cultivation, Quebec and Manitoba being 2 of those jurisdictions. In terms of accidental poisoning, Poison Control Center data has actually been a really valuable means to track the impact of increased cannabis availability. In the U.S., Poison Center and hospital admission data as well has been actively used to track the impact on children. This data has suggested that the ingestion of cannabis resin, hashish, which I've put on the screen, is actually more common than edibles like cookies or candies, and that just as many children become intoxicated from ingesting a waste product like an unfinished joint. Now, I think looking at this photo on the screen, we can all think of one very clear reason why this might be. Hashish looks a lot like chocolate. And second, which is something that we've hypothesized with working with the poison control people, is that childproof packaging is actually quite commonly used for edible products, and people are much more diligent about storing edibles than they are about waste products. Parents do tend to put cookies and candies on higher shelves. They put them in locked cabinets, but they're not as conscientious about leaving unfinished joints out. And I think we all know that children are weirdly curious and put everything in their mouths, so that's a real reality when it comes to accidental poisoning. Next. This is Kellen. This is my dog. 3 days after our paper was published, he ate an entire cannabis cookie. He went to a friend's house overnight. She was going to take him hiking the next day. Her roommate left a cannabis cookie out on the coffee table. It was in its wrapper. It was in its bag. It was the equivalent of 6 doses for a human. And he ate the wrapper, the cookie, and the bag it came in. And so they didn't actually know that that's what he had consumed until 6 hours later when her roommate was looking everywhere and found a tiny bit of the paper left on the carpet. He was fine, don't worry, he survived. This is just his regular dopey look, not his post-cannabis look. But actually it's a huge concern. I mean, when people don't pay attention to those kinds of things, this is actually definitely a fatal dose for most dogs. And this is not an uncommon call that the Poison Control Center gets. I just felt really lucky that I didn't have to make that call and disguise my voice when I was trying to talk to them about what was going on with the dog. Next. So what are some policy considerations for accidental poisoning? Given that there are lots of studies that show a clear relationship between decriminalization and increased frequency of poisonings, there are a couple things that are critical here. First, we do need to promote safe practices for cannabis plant products and waste at home. This really means a lot of public education on safe and thoughtful management of cannabis and waste. A second critical point is that we should promote and support poison control centers 100% on this issue. They do play an invaluable role in providing immediate anonymous advice on cannabis poisoning, and physicians and emergency departments can also benefit from this resource where they don't have cannabis expertise themselves. Third, surveillance is essential when it comes to better understanding how and to whom cannabis poisonings occur. One idea might be to require physicians and hospitals to report cannabis intoxication to provincial health agencies, the way that they do for opioid overdose reporting, for instance. And that just gives us more data to work with, which is helpful at this point. Finally, it is essential that provisions are made for waste disposal, which is particularly relevant for municipalities, and I'm sure you're all working with municipalities in different contexts on this. For medical cannabis users, Health Canada has previously recommended blending cannabis waste material with water, mixing it with cat litter, and disposing of it in the trash. But depending on the scale of personal production in a community and local policies on organic material and municipal waste, which vary in intensity, and I live in Vancouver, and Vancouver is very intense about waste disposal, so certainly putting cat litter in your organic bin is not acceptable. It's definitely going to be necessary to provide alternative disposal options that are very much in line with local recycling and waste procedures. Next. Excuse me. Okay, so let's turn to our second risk, indoor air quality. The first aspect of indoor air quality that I want to touch on is humidity and mold. Humidity is a big issue with cannabis, both because poor humidity control can allow fungus to grow on the plant, but also because it can create a mold issue in the home itself. There's a lot of humidity associated with cannabis because, firstly, the young plants actually need very high humidity to survive until they can develop their own root systems. They start out needing about 70% humidity, and then over time that can decrease to 40%. But once you have a bunch of mature rooted plants, those plants themselves start to cause a humidity problem because one mature plant produces as much moisture as about 7 tropical plants in a home. So in illicit grows, growers have tried to seal the moisture in, mostly for humidity and temperature control, and sometimes to control odor as well, but because that's how illicit growers are often caught because of the smell. Excuse me. But so as you can see, both growing mature plants and helping young plants establish themselves requires that humidity to be present. In Canada, this is particularly relevant because our homes are winterized for energy efficiency. It means that they're pretty airtight and there are low ventilation rates, which means that moisture and mold and humidity are already an issue, as I'm sure you're aware. So cannabis growing just kind of exacerbates that issue that already exists. Given this context, it's possible that even a few plants, the 4-plant limit, is equivalent to 28 tropical plants. Like that can certainly exacerbate a moisture issue in the home, and can perhaps create a humidity problem if there happened to not be one before. Next. The next air quality issue is odor. Now, for a bit of technical background, cannabis-related odors are derived from a kind of complex mixture of hundreds of volatile compounds that are produced alongside the odorless cannabinoids in the resinous secretion part of the flower. Odors do increase with flowering and may also intensify during drying, curing, and processing as those oils are volatilized in the air. The combination of these compounds does vary among species and hybrids and may subjectively be more or less pleasant. But the takeaway message here is that to date there's no actual evidence to suggest that cannabis odors are specifically detrimental to human health. However, as with any strong odor, it can be argued that odor in itself impacts well-being through annoyance and disruption and stress. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this, PHO actually did an evidence review on cannabis-related odors that came out last summer, which is also on our cannabis topic page. So I'm going to encourage you all to check that out if odor is something that's coming up for you in your work. Next. The third indoor air quality issue to take note of is carbon monoxide. CO is a hazardous byproduct of propane or natural gas-powered carbon dioxide generators or burners. And you may have heard that those are sometimes used to enhance plant growth and increase yield because, CO2 increases plant productivity generally. We have found also that these ignition devices can create an explosion hazard if there's a fire due to the presence of compressed gas. Another way CO can be a problem is that people do tend or have tended in illicit grows to vent their furnaces or water heaters directly into the grow room to increase CO2 production, but that obviously comes with a host of risks, including increased carbon monoxide. So there's a couple of ways that this can be problematic, as I'm sure you can imagine. Next. So when it comes to indoor air quality, there are a few policy interventions that can have an impact on environmental health. First, limit plant numbers. Because impacts on indoor air quality scale up with the number of plants across the board when it comes to odor as well as humidity and mold, as well as carbon monoxide. Low plant limits should help minimize risk for home growers, but because, as I mentioned, this is going to be impossible to enforce, overgrowth is considered likely, and so limiting alone isn't going to mitigate these indoor air quality risks. It just helps to curtail them, hopefully. Second, we can avoid a lot of these humidity and mold issues by growing outside of the home. Several provinces have indicated that they will permit outdoor open air growing on private property, including the Yukon. Although this does increase the risk of theft and may exacerbate odor complaints, so there's a balance here, and it's why many of the provinces have chosen to limit outdoor growing. Third, people may want to consider the use of indoor air cleaners. However, and this is a big however, air filtration units they're typically pretty limited in their ability to capture mold spores. And to date, there haven't been any formal evaluations of the efficiency of portable air filtration units or air cleaners in the context of indoor cannabis cultivation specifically. Finally, we want to discourage the use of ignition devices indoors. This is kind of a no-brainer here because gas-powered CO2 generators are readily available in Canada and are also used outside the home in greenhouses, for instance. Banning the sale of those devices is going to be challenging since they are used for legitimate purposes. Sacramento County bans the use of CO2 generators in indoor grows after legalization, but it's unclear how this ban might be enforced, and they haven't really provided any more details on that. Next. So let's move to our third category of environmental health risk. As with all other types of gardeners, and that's generally how I like to talk about this issue, is that we really are talking about gardening issues. Cannabis cultivators do have to deal with common insects, such as spider mites, aphids, attacking the plants. These are, of course, not a health risk themselves, but any pesticides sprayed on the plants to control them might very well be. There are a couple of key issues with pesticides and pest management. The first, which I've pointed out at the top, is cultivation conditions can make cannabis susceptible to pests. And because mold or blight can quickly wipe out a whole crop, there's very strong financial incentive for the producer to use more potent options. So when I say cultivation conditions, I mean generally people will grow their plants in a room altogether. They'll be sealed in, as I mentioned. There's high efficiency homes in Canada, which means there isn't a lot of place for pests to get out or in, and once they're in, they can proliferate really rapidly because it's usually a small, moist, warm area. The second issue, which is specific to the United States, is that cannabis is federally prohibited, which means that federal regulatory agencies like the EPA, the FDA, and the USDA will not get involved. They're just not being a part of this at all. So that means that there are no EPA-registered pesticides for cannabis in the U.S., and that means, again, that those formal risk assessments are just not getting done. So that's a huge barrier at the moment if we don't have bodies like that getting involved in pesticide regulation. Next. Now, the situation in Canada is very different. We have legalized across Canada, and we have regulatory agencies, specifically Health Canada and the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, that have already done quite a bit of work on pest control for medical cannabis. Currently, there are 20 pesticides registered for use on medical cannabis, and they include a mix of oils, salters, detergents, and biological control via bacteria that tend to leave insecticidal toxins on the plant. The thing is that these pesticides are fairly innocuous, and the risks are not actually too high if growers abuse these a little bit because they are innocuous. However, even though we have these options available, there are no synthetics on this list. And so there is a pretty strong concern that if a grower is faced with a catastrophic loss, they're still going to reach for a more potent and potentially dangerous option. So getting those formal assessments done is going to become critical, or people will just choose a pesticide that they find on the shelf that's for some other use that they've decided will work in their home. Next. So given this landscape, there are a few considerations to keep in mind here. First, growing outside comes up again. As with indoor air quality issues, moving the grow outdoors, or conversely to a secure, non-attached structure on the property, would reduce the risk of children, pets, or adults coming into contact with the pesticide product. Second, identifying and promoting those low-risk products is going to be really important. In the commercial cannabis sector, regulators in Canada and the U.S. have taken, aggressive action to eliminate these high-risk products, which has included things like guidance and inspection and testing and recalls and fines. And there have actually been a lot of recalls on pesticides for cannabis in the U.S. We do need similar and appropriate efforts to be made for home growers in Canada in particular. And at the very minimum, products approved for commercial producers should be reevaluated for home use because the conditions are going to be much different. Without specific changes to those products, product labeling that clearly indicates home use on cannabis is going to be one small step that we definitely need to address. Otherwise, the public are likely to continue to utilize potentially dangerous products that are intended for use on other crops. Just for a note on using it for other crops, people who are starting this for the first time are not necessarily going to be cognizant of the fact that when you inhale a pesticide product, such as when you were smoking it, excuse me, that might be different than if you were eating a pesticide that was on a strawberry. So the fact that there's no differentiation in stores right now between pesticides that might be safe to inhale versus those that can be consumed is a big issue. That's kind of why that third point on developing cannabis-specific pesticide guidance is going to be so critical going forward. Next. So now we're going to turn to electrical and fire hazards. These risks are often linked to inappropriate or improperly installed equipment, the presence of combustible materials in the space, and also illegal cannabis processing. So first, high wattage grow lamps produce enough heat to cause serious burns, which I'm sure most of you know. But they also draw a large amount of power, and that increases not only the risks of shocks and overloads, but it increases the risks of fires. Some homeowners may exacerbate these risks by installing large circuit breakers to avoid power interruptions, because you wouldn't want your plants to go without any light if that were to happen, or by messing with the home's wiring directly, which are all pretty intense electrical risks in themselves. Other fire hazards include the presence of fertilizers and pesticides, compressed gas, for CO2 generation, as I mentioned earlier, and actually just having a lot of dried plant material around. It's a recipe for fire disaster in all senses of the word. If there is a fire, these items can also increase the risk of explosion and may decrease the time to escape. So because of these and other physical and structural hazards, home grows are considered to be much more risky to first responders than typical residential fires, and also to occupants in need of rescue. So not only do all of these things in themselves make fires more likely, but having them around all together, the chemicals, the dried plant material, the lighting overloads, compressed gas, because you've been pumping CO2 into the space, it's just a bad soup of things all put together there. Next. A second component of the electrical and fire hazard story is illegal cannabis processing. This is very hazardous and poses additional risks of fires, burns, and explosions, but under the Act, individuals are allowed to process cannabis at home with some limitations. I think the most high-profile case happened actually just a month or two ago in Ontario, just in Oshawa. The whole side of a house was blown off from somebody who's processing cannabis in the basement. It's not uncommon at all, and there are many, many cases of this happening over the last couple of years. Although those cannabis concentrates can be produced through various means, extraction using butane or other organic solvents is of particular concern, which is how most of these explosions have happened. The process involves literally blasting a pressurized organic solvent through an open-ended tube or column that's been packed with cannabis, and then collecting the liquid that flows from the bottom. Once you've got that liquid, you want to purge the solvent that you used using a heat source, and then you get that kind of golden hash oil, which is the picture I've put at the top right here. Despite these pretty intense risks, hash oil is still very appealing for a couple of reasons. First, it can have incredibly high potency, up to 90% THC in some cases. Second, it can be produced cheaply from cannabis trimmings that would otherwise be discarded, which lets homegrowers avoid the so-called waste and maximize their return on investment. So as the raw material becomes more available after legalization, serious burn injuries due to hash oil explosions may actually increase. And I think that's something that goes back to what I was talking about with access earlier, is that if we don't actually have something set in place for the waste materials, people are going to use every piece of it because you can actually get this hash oil, and it's not the same as the bud area that people would use either to smoke or to process in some other way. Next. So let's take a look at the policy considerations to help deal with some of these issues. Although growers are obviously still going to resort to hazardous practice, or some of them are anyway, hopefully legalization will actually encourage some safety-conscious growers to contract professional installers or electricians rather than attempt modifications on their own. In the meantime, there are several approaches that might mitigate equipment-related electrical and fire hazards. First, we can use municipal building electrical and fire codes or federal legislation to regulate the sale and installation of high-wattage hydroponic systems. Second, we just can encourage the use of lower-risk equipment if we're putting forth education campaigns. So, for example, LED lighting systems can reduce energy usage and heat output, and they've been shown to be just as effective at encouraging plant growth. So it's getting those messages out there that's going to be important. Regarding hash oil production in particular, legalizing home grows without those provisions for waste, and processing the raw material, as I mentioned, is very likely to increase the risk of explosion. So interventions aimed at reducing in-home production should consider a couple of different factors. One, how available that raw material is. Two, how severe the legal consequences are if you're found to be contravening those regulations. And three, whether we provide access to legally produced regulated commercial concentrates. Now, that's something to consider in both sides. In 2 states that legalized, they raised their penalties to over $900,000 if you were found processing cannabis in your home. So that's a pretty significant penalty. But Washington State took a different approach. Sorry, I meant California and Colorado were the 2 states that made their fines quite high. But Washington State decided instead to legalize the sale of concentrates. which meant that you could still gain access to that very high THC product, but most people wouldn't take the risk of doing it in their own home because it's clearly a very risky procedure. However, there's a balance there because there isn't a lot of evidence on how safe using those products actually is, and because we think that it actually still is quite risky. Most jurisdictions are not going to go in that direction right to begin with. But when you think about the explosions, Washington State hasn't had any hash oil explosions, and Colorado and California, respectively, have had something like 100 and something explosions each since they legalized, which is not a small number in the grand scheme of things. Finally, we do want to just promote less hazardous methods in general. Explosion risk and exposure to residual solvent can be reduced by promoting non-organic solvent-based extraction processes, either at home or in commercial operations, because this isn't an issue that's just a home grow issue. It's certainly an issue for commercial grows as well. Next. Okay, so let's move to the last environmental health risk, which is radiation. Grow lamps are often used to intentionally produce high-intensity UV light to either increase THC content via UVA or B, or to control fungal spores in the air on surfaces, which is through the use of UVC. It's fairly easy to access UV equipment, but it does mean that growers can tamper with UV bulbs by removing the filters, which increases UVC output. These practices can increase the risk of UV-related skin and eye damage, depending on the amount of time they're used and whether any shielding or personal protective equipment is used. Several studies, which I've put up on the slide here, have identified increased health risks from exposure to UV in commercial grow-ops, including one that found that working for 8 hours in the nursery would cause a worker to exceed the threshold limit value for UV by about 9-fold. And that's just one day of work, so this is not a small problem. Certainly not a small problem for commercial settings, but potentially a problem in personal homes as well. Next. So I put a photo up here of a worker in a commercial facility tending to plants. He's got on some long sleeves and some sunglasses, which is great, but his neck and head are unprotected. The hairnet and sleeves, incidentally, are actually to prevent kind of the resinous sticking part of the flower from being contaminated with human hair. They're not actually to protect the worker at all. So a hairnet and sleeves is not really sufficient to reduce radiation exposure. It's definitely to make sure the cannabis plant isn't contaminated in any way. Next. So some policy considerations for radiation. Unfortunately, as with some of the CO2 generators, UV-emitting lamps are widely and commercially available for a variety of applications, including drinking water treatment, air purification, all sorts of very legitimate things. And the products do vary widely in quality and may not or may be certified for a particular use. At the moment, it really is the responsibility of the consumer to read and obey manufacturers' recommendations on safe uses of UV-emitting products, if any. And to our knowledge, the potential risks of UV-emitting devices have not actually been addressed in other jurisdictions outside of occupational settings. So it's something to pay attention to, encourage people to become educated on, and especially in terms of other lighting options such as LED bulbs. But it's very difficult to intervene in something like this because lighting is so prolific and so easy to get wherever you need to buy it. So it's something to watch for and to talk to people about, but at this point, interventions are going to be very much focused on education. Next. So now that we've been through those environmental health risks, I do want to turn to public risk messaging briefly. Because legalization in Canada is still evolving, which is to say each of the provinces and the territories are constantly tweaking their laws and putting in new bits and pieces that they've decided will help reduce the risks for their populations. Interventions are limited because nothing is really set in stone at this point. So proactive and focused risk messaging is going to be critical to address some of these health risks of home growing. As I mentioned, throughout the consideration sections, enforcement is going to be challenging even after everything has been fully developed, which is another reason why education campaigns and having a bit more public discourse on cultivation is going to be key to promoting health and safety. In our paper on home cultivation, we've developed a table, which you shouldn't be able to see here in great detail. I'll zoom into one of the sections in a moment, with recommended public risk messages related to each of those 5 environmental health risks that I mentioned. I know it's not worth dwelling on this in any detail, so if you'd like to look at the table, I'm going to encourage you to do that. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to just choose one of them to give you some examples. So next. So here are some risk messages, just a few of them, that we put together for indoor air quality. This is how you can maybe tailor your conversations in terms of harm reduction approaches. 1, you want to encourage people to scale production according to the ventilation capacity of their home, the sensitivity of the occupants to mold. So, for instance, if there are any asthmatics that live there, or if they have particular respiratory problems, and their particular ability to control odor. Do they have air filtration units? Do they have carbon filters, etc.? Second, we do want to encourage people to control humidity. They can assess and reduce moisture sources. People are able to restrict cultivation to humidity-controlled rooms. They can use dehumidifiers as required. So these are things that we want to point out to people. We do want to encourage people to be vigilant for signs of dampness or mold, consult professionals if needed, and legalization in this case is actually incredibly helpful because it means that people are more likely to consult professionals, since there's hopefully going to be less and less stigma around this issue and people are going to be able to have conversations a little bit more freely. We want people to be able to dispose of mold-infested plants safely and quickly and have an option to do so that's in line with their local waste processing regulations. We 100% need the public to consider non-ignition methods of CO2 enrichment. And we do want to equip all homes with a CO detector. It's a proven life-saving intervention, particularly in homes with a fuel-burning appliance, regardless of whether cannabis is cultivated or not. So these messages are very straightforward and certainly don't carry any judgment along with them. They're definitely meant to help people reduce their exposure to these risks without telling them that they should not be doing this under any circumstances. Next. Oh, sorry. Next again, except it's just going to put a few things on the slide. And once more. Thank you. So the NCCEH sits on the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Cannabis Communication, and part of the role of that group is to develop and discuss cannabis communication strategies. That work also focuses on identifying the challenges that come in crafting these messages in a consistent way across the country and across different health jurisdictions. So there are a couple of things that we should all be keeping in mind when we develop these messages. And first, it's how we can adequately and fairly inform users of the risks to themselves and others, how our messages can actually reduce harms to those who choose to use and choose to grow, and how we can not rely on stereotypes, fear, stigma when we're doing those things. Much of this work has actually grown out of risk communication basics that are used as standards in emergency situations, so floods and wildfires, etc. And the main tenet of this approach is basically to be first and to be right and to be credible, and that's a really good approach for public health in general, I think. We do want to get these messages across in plain, simple language, and we want to make sure that we're targeting the right audience for the right message. So, for example, if we're talking about home growing and we want to provide risk messages to adults about indoor air quality, we may want to direct communications about CO detectors to neighborhood groups or to different Home Depot-type stores, rather than during education campaigns targeted at youth about managing harms from consumption. We do really have to just pay attention about the targets of our campaigns and where those messages are going to be the most helpful. Next. Sorry, next again. One more. Thank you. It's also really important in all these conversations, and specifically when we're talking about community risk in a public health setting, that we understand the limits of the evidence that we have. We don't know everything about cannabis. We don't know everything about the risks of use, about long-term effects, about the risks of growing at home. So mostly this is because it's very difficult to study while it's been illegal. So we actually need and are very grateful in some ways that legalization has come into place so that we can facilitate some research on these issues. Because of these limitations, credibility is key, because public health definitely has a history of reefer hysteria, and people do still tend to perceive public health messages this way. Even as recently as 2015 or 2018 when a very large-scale study on perceptions of cannabis use by youth was implemented, and that was definitely the message that was still coming back. In the meantime, before we do have concrete evidence coming out of studies post-legalization, we at public health organizations should stick to what we do know, and there are a couple of things that we can be pretty confident about. One, inhaling particulates and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons is bad, regardless of what you're smoking, and we have enough evidence to be able to say that confidently. Second, careless use and storage can lead to poisonings, children, pet, adult poisonings, all of them. 3, driving while impaired is dangerous. And 4, there are both smart and not smart ways to grow cannabis at home, as I've talked about today. Next. Okay, so just to wrap up, what can we do to reduce these environmental health risks? First and foremost, there are still a lot of uncertainties. The magnitude and duration of these risks I talked about depend on a couple of different things, and mostly that's about extent, scale, and persistence. So how many people are going to choose to grow at home, how big are those grows going to get, and how many people actually stick with it. We don't know that information yet. We don't have a sense of whether this is going to be a problem at a very large scale or whether it's really not at all. It's just going to take time to figure that out. I mean, at the moment, like maybe it's just going to be my parents in the backyard putting one plant between their raspberry canes and laughing to themselves about how that's adorable. We don't know if that's going to be the norm, if people are going to realize it actually takes quite a lot of effort to get cannabis plants to grow to full maturity, or they're just going to go to the store and buy when they want to try it. We really don't have a sense, and that's going to determine whether these risks come into play at a larger public health scale. We do want to incentivize safe practices regardless. They will reduce some of these risks. Safety campaigns should consider cannabis in all of its forms, including raw plant materials, products, including concentrates, edibles, and joints that will become more popular in the market once legalization pushes those products through next fall, as well as the waste products that I've talked about a couple times. Safe practices should include secure storage, least risky means of processing, and appropriate disposal. One example of safe practices might actually be the promotion and distribution of cannabis safety kits, which has been tossed around by a couple of municipalities. They would be targeted towards home growers, and particularly homes with children. Those kits could contain stickers with a standardized cannabis symbol, child-resistant bags or lock boxes, box to install on cupboards, and most importantly, first aid and contact information for the local poison control center. I do also want to point out that interest in cannabis legalization might serve to increase engagement around other long-standing public health issues that are not unique to cannabis. These are issues like humidity and indoor mold that I mentioned, the dangers of carbon monoxide, the safe use of pesticides, particularly indoors, and indoor quality more generally. For example, if we include carbon monoxide poisoning in cannabis risk messaging, that might help to increase general awareness and safety, particularly if homeowners are installed those CO detectors. It just means that we can leverage a bit of this public interest in cannabis to help mediate some of these general health risks that we're already dealing with in Canada. I haven't mentioned this today, and we haven't really had time to go through it, but a big component of the environmental health risks around cannabis is going to be around edibles. And hopefully the NCCEH will be continuing in this sphere in the coming year, but certainly too much for the scope of this presentation. So I want to encourage you to look forward to that in the coming year. Next, and then next again. I've included some references here because I know the slides will be posted if you're looking for it. And then next. I've also put a shortened link up here so you don't have to come back to the slides if you don't want to. If you're looking for the full evidence review that informs this presentation, there's a short bit.ly link there. And as I mentioned, the Cannabis topic page has a host of resources, which is basically just a curated list that we like to put together on a lot of different topics to help people navigate the information that they need the most. So I would encourage you to check that out if you do want any more information. And I think we're right on time right now, so we've got about 15 minutes for questions if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm sorry for the coughing. Sorry, I'm going to scroll up here. Great. So there's one question that's come up on the screen, which is the definition of, what is the definition of cannabis poisoning? So that's a great question. It differs for each individual because basically cannabis reacts through the endocannabinoid system, and every person reacts to it differently. So for children, it can manifest itself in cyclical vomiting and coma. For adults, it might manifest itself in just vomiting. When you get to a point where alcohol poisoning happens to a person, that's certainly going to look different for everybody. Poisoning very, very rarely, and in fact, I don't think it's ever resulted in a death, except for when somebody has gotten so high that they've thrown themselves off a balcony. It hasn't been a death from a poisoning of the system. But the consequences can be quite severe in terms of coma and damage to your internal systems. So it's not a hard definition. It's certainly just a set of symptoms that can occur. The next question is, what's in a cannabis safety kit, which I just mentioned, but in my last slide. But that's something that's kind of up for discussion. I think that from the conversations that I've been in, cannabis safety kits can look like a whole bunch of different things. Maybe there's one particular region that has a big problem with humidity, so in their kits they might want to include a humidity monitor, and you could potentially go to City Hall, or you could go to Home Depot and say, oh, I'll spend the $50 on my cannabis safety kit, and I've got all my first aid supplies, and I've got instructions on pesticides, and here's my humidity monitor, and et cetera, et cetera. It's certainly something that's up for discussion. It's not something that's hard and fast. It's just the idea of having a go-to place for people to get the resources they need that doesn't feel like somewhere they have to be judged or experience any kind of stigma in asking for that information. So if all of it's collected in one place, they don't have to go scanning the internet for the best forums on how to grow cannabis safely. They can actually have those instructions in one convenient place. Are there any other questions from the group? I'm happy to stick around if people want to chime in at any moment.
Looks like we have one more person just typing here, so we'll see if they have a question for you, Leela.
Of course, yeah. How are LED lights helping with plant growth versus UV lights? Well, I didn't mean to say that they act differently from UV lights in terms of facilitating plant growth. It's just that they don't carry the same risks as UV lights in that they don't get hot. And they also don't take as much energy and therefore are less likely to cause electrical issues on your grid or shut down the wiring system in your home if they're overheated or what have you. So they actually provide exactly the same amount of light to plants and have been shown to be just as effective if you're buying LED grow lights versus UV lights. What do you consider a dose of cannabis from your dog story? So a dose of cannabis has been most often cited around 10 milligrams of cannabis. Something that I find quite ridiculous in the edibles conversation is that one cookie often has 6 doses for an adult human. So there might be enough to have 1/6 of a cookie to be one high for a person for a particular period of time. I find that quite ridiculous because who in general is going to eat 1/6 of a cookie? Why not put one dose in one cookie? That makes a lot more sense to me. So I think there are going to be some laws that come out of that conversation for sure. It's certainly not safe when it comes to children because maybe you leave one cookie out, but you might not leave 6 cookies out. So it's definitely more risky to put more THC in each edible product and expect people to properly choose the right quantity for themselves without being a little bit more conscientious about how those doses are divided. But I think generally 10 milligrams is kind of used as the standard dose, but there is a lot of talk about making low-dose products for those who are just coming into cannabis use, especially, as I've heard, elderly populations, and in terms of using products like lozenges or gummies, having options for a smaller dose has certainly been discussed to kind of mitigate some of those risks of people who don't really understand the potency of what 10 milligrams means. Okay. Is there any information or documents regarding homeowners versus renters? Yeah, there are certainly guidelines for that, but again, that's by municipality and province. So it's not something that's happened Canada-wide. I do know that many jurisdictions have said that a landlord or strata is able to make whatever rules that they want to make, and renters are obliged to abide by them, or owners within the strata are obliged to abide by them. But I have no doubt that those are court challenges waiting to happen, because if the federal government has come down and said that this is a legal thing that you can do, I think it's going to become quite difficult to control that in those cases. Excuse me. Does the size of the home increase the air quality concerns? That is it more risk to grow in a smaller home? Yeah, I mean, I guess that has to do with scaling up, right? So if you're in a tiny 5x5 square room and you've decided to grow 10 plants, the risk within that room is going to be certainly larger than if you were in an enormous, like 30x30 room. But just in terms of how much humidity can be generated by each plant, and how much mold can grow on each plant. I mean, once you have mold or once you have pests, it's hard to get rid of. I mean, prevention is obviously a much better approach than trying to deal with mold once it's established. But yeah, that goes back to what I was talking about in terms of assessing the ventilation capacity of those rooms, assessing how well humidity or dehumidifier you have in those rooms. So yeah, I think the grow space certainly has a role to play. But one plant in a room that size, that small, maybe it wouldn't be as much of an issue. I think a lot of these risks are about scale. So that's certainly a good point to make, and scaling down and up according to the space that you have is absolutely the wisest decision to make, for sure. Next, could you comment on edibles and possible impacts on PHI's roles in inspecting food premises? I can loosely comment on edibles, but we haven't finished our evidence review on that issue yet. There are a couple of different environmental health risks from edibles that we foresee being an issue. The first is bacterial contamination. The thing is, a lot of these commercial facilities, and I'm not going to comment on the process of making edibles at home. I think the bigger issue is going to be commercial production of these edibles. A lot of these commercial facilities know very well how to grow cannabis. Like, they're excellent at growing cannabis, but they're not really food safety people. They've never made food. And they might be making these products in like an attached kitchen on the side of this enormous greenhouse, which isn't fantastic for food safety. So bacterial contamination is one issue that we're foreseeing being a problem with edible products. The second is pesticide contamination. We really have to get on the ball about what pesticides are going to be appropriate for use on cannabis that's going to be turned into edibles. It's a very, very big field, and there are a lot of pesticide producers in the States that are trying to be a bit proactive about this because of the contamination levels in edibles that have been tested in kind of a rogue fashion by investigative journalists, shall we say, have found like surprisingly high levels of pesticide contamination. And the third big issue with food safety in edibles is likely to be THC content. It's very inconsistent, and at this point, if there aren't clear guidelines on how to test and how to make sure that every product that you're selling actually has the right amount of THC that is labeled, that's going to be a huge problem. Because, I mean, to begin with, people don't really understand how edibles are processed in the body. When somebody is given a joint to smoke, they have an idea that it'll take 30 minutes or so, 3 minutes to 30 minutes, depending. But edibles can take up to 3 hours. So it's tricky. If you put a dose in there that's twice the dose that somebody expects and it takes 3 hours, after an hour of nothing happening, they're going to take a second one, which means they now have 4 doses. Another hour happening, they haven't felt anything, they're going to take 6 doses. And that becomes quite quickly problematic. So those are the 3 big things that I would look out for. And when it comes to inspecting food premises, I mean, that's a little bit of a different ballgame. It depends if you're talking about the places where these products are being made or if you're talking about restaurants that are going to begin serving cannabis products in their foods. We haven't delved deeply enough into the food premises bit in terms of serving, but those 3 things that I mentioned in terms of pesticides and THC and bacterial contamination are going to be the things to look for in the places that are actually producing the edibles. Okay, you referred to accessing the info/slides. Where can we see or get them? I believe they will be posted, the actual presentation, so you'll have my voice as well, through whatever PHO usually does for the Sci-Fi Seminar Series, maybe on their YouTube channel or what have you.
I can comment on that, Leela. It's Rachel. They'll be posted on the Sci-Fi Ontario YouTube channel shortly after the session's done.
I would also recommend, if you're looking for more information on this, we have put together a 2-page fact sheet to kind of summarize this evidence review because it's quite a long review. If you're looking just to get a sense of like the Coles notes on the 5 risks and then key risk messages to go with each of them, I would encourage you to just Google NCCEH Growing at Home, and it should bring you to our page, and you'll be, or even NCCEH Growing at Home fact sheet, and you'll be able to get there. However, my email is also on the slide, so if you have any questions about this, I am happy to refer anybody to any resource that they need or answer any questions after the session is done. I'm quite available and spend much of my time answering questions about cannabis, so I'm very, very happy to point you in the direction of whatever resource you're looking for. Did any of the questions that I answered not feel answered enough? Like, was it clear enough to the edibles question and the homeowner versus renter and the dose, etc.? Yeah? I'm going to give everybody a minute to like think through that and type more in the slide.
Okay, Leela, I think that looks like all the questions. So I would like to thank everyone who joined us today for the Sci-Fi Ontario Seminar Series. It is great to have such participation online. I'd also like to thank Leela Steiner for presenting, even though you are just getting over an illness. Thank you so much, Leela.
Thank you for putting up with my coughing, everybody. I appreciate it.
So I hope you feel better. And I just wanted to let everyone know that there will be an evaluation coming from this session, so if you could please complete that, that would be great. It will be emailed out to you this Friday versus right after the session today. So wait for that this Friday, and please fill that out. It will help us figure out and determine maybe what else people are looking for presentations. And I would also ask that you reflect on how the information provided in this session can be used in your current work setting. So I hope you all have a great day, and thanks again.
Thanks very much.